Bow, 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 bow. Thank you. So I grew up in the back of a law office. My father was a small town lawyer in the Mississippi Delta, and my mother was his secretary. It's not as glamorous as it sounds. He lost his house in his first divorce. So my father, mother, and I lived in a pretty shabby addition tacked onto the rear of his practice. Had 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, a kitchen, and a living room. Clients used our bathroom. The kitchen floor sloped to a settling foundation, and the walls of the living room were lined with tan and green rows of Southern Reporter and American jurisprudence. But my father had been raised Depression era small, and this was not only cheap, it gave him an excuse to never leave work. "We've got everything we need right here," he'd say, working on a brief as we sat in front of the television in the law library. We knew better than to complain, but books weren't enough. So outside the office/house, there was another obstacle for an 8-year-old redheaded bookworm. With law offices on either side, county courthouse across the street, and the county jail a half block behind, there were no neighbors. And no neighbors meant no kids. So when I made a friend, I clung to him, even when the friend was Marty. Marty was lean and lanky, at 9 going on 14. His mother managed a clothing store downtown, and summertime she would send Marty over to play with me while she worked. My parents weren't crazy about Marty, but they didn't have many options. He was unrestrained. If we passed a bicycle in someone's front yard, he was in the saddle with a "watch this," then carving no handlebars S's down the street until he tired of it and dropped the bike by the curb. At the corner grocery, if he wanted a candy bar, one walked out the door with him. He'd occasionally offer me a bite, and I would picture my father's gray eyes turning on me like a hostile witness, but I liked Butterfingers, and I didn't like saying no. One day in July, Marty and I were sitting around my room playing with G.I. Joes. I always played the one with the kepi, the real American hero who apparently served with the French Foreign Legion. Marty fingered the bare patch where his Joe's beard had rubbed off, then tossed the doll on the bed. "Let's go down to the riverbank." This was far beyond bike borrowing. This was adventure like I'd only read about. Me as Tom Sawyer, Marty as this feral Huck Finn embarking from Hannibal to float down the mighty Mississippi. But I shook my head. That's the only place I'm not allowed to go. My parents say I'll drown or get bit by something. I go there all the time. I ain't never drowned. Well, Marty's logic was impeccable and his pull was irresistible. And really, wasn't this why I liked him? He gave me permission to do things I shouldn't and to be who I wasn't. Well, I couldn't imagine asking my mother, so I told her we were going to go play behind the office. And Marty and I headed out across the street, around the side of the county jail, and down through chest-high jimson weed to the Sunflower River, a muddy slough that stank in the summer sun. We killed the afternoon unsuccessfully poking sticks into holes to flush out crawdads, wading in turgid water and then drying in the sun to the steady hum of cicadas. I picked up a tuft of brown and white hair from the riverbank and showed it to Marty. "Oh, that's from when I was down here yesterday. Killed a rabbit," he said. "Really?" I rubbed the fur between my fingers, soft and slick, and the fibers caught the sun as I held them up. "Yeah, rabbit's gone." He stood quickly and looked around. "But here's the stick I used." He picked up a piece of wood and showed it to me. And I looked at it, a little over a foot long, an inch thick with a slight crook toward the end. I imagined the skill it took to wing that through the air and nail a moving rabbit. To a Southern boy, this was even more manly than dipping. Marty stood a foot taller in my eyes. We hung out until dusk drove us home, and as soon as I walked in the kitchen, the dried mud on my Wranglers gave it all away. My mother was mad, and my father was quiet, never a good sign. Secretly, I was glad they had caught me because I couldn't contain my pride in my friend any longer. I told them all about Marty and the rabbit, kind of hoping their awe would excuse me. You saw the rabbit? My mother asked. Well, no, ma'am, but he showed me the stick. My parents looked at each other and shook their heads. My father went to his closet and pulled his belt from his hook and led me to the library. This is going to hurt me more than it hurts you. He said that every time. He hesitated on the backswing and then leaned over and looked me in the eye as if he was breaking the news about Santa Claus. Son, there was no rabbit. He used his courtroom voice and his courtroom eyes, and my idol's feet collapsed. There was no fight with Marty, no big blow off. We hung out through August. And then when school started, our friendship died of natural causes. I suppose the ease with which we drifted away from each other says, I'd always known what Marty was, but bad friends are like bad marriages. You convince yourself it's better than being alone. Well, if this were fiction, I'd tie this all up with a nice moral about the power of belief or the dangers of hero worship, or even some epiphany about my parents and rebellion. Instead, I learned a lesson, one that's carried me through 3 divorces and years of not talking to my father. When it's dead, let it go quietly. Life rarely comes with climactic closure, and final words are just too much work.